Thank you for joining me on From the Lectern. This is Walter Strickland. I'm here with Dr. Carl Ellis. He's been with us today for our 4th annual Black History Celebration Luncheon, where he delivered a lecture on African American missions heritage. And we just want to continue our discussion even here. And a question that we want to engage is, can minorities thrive in white evangelical spaces? And as of late, in the last, I would say even 8 to 10 months, it seems like more and more people are answering that question, especially from the minority communities, saying no. And so what I want to do with Dr. Ellis is just engage you with this question. But before we jump into some of the nuts and bolts of everything, you went to Hampton University.
That's right.
Which is at HBCU.
HBCU.
And then you ended up doing a master's degree at Westminster Theological Seminary.
That's right.
So culturally, these two contexts are on different sides of this sort of black-white spectrum. And so as we talk about the question, can minorities thrive in white evangelical spaces, what do you make of this question based on your own experience?
Well, when I went to Hampton, now it's interesting. I went to Hampton during the days of the Cultural Revolution. We went from being Negroes to being Afro-Americans. I mean, that was, and of course, later on it became black, right? And so at Hampton, I was able to wrestle through all of this, what it means to be black and so forth and so on. And because that was a major change. I mean, we went from, the conventional wisdom was the way you succeed in America is that you assimilate into the dominant culture. Mm-hmm. But all of a sudden, people were saying, we're not going to do that anymore. And that was a major change. So what happened, because I was in an African-American environment, when I came to understand my blackness and all the rest of that, it was based on things that I agreed with, things that I affirmed. And so I was able to make that transition. Now, what if I had gone to a predominantly white university under the same conditions? Then my blackness would have been shaped by my not being white. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. My blackness would be shaped by anti-whiteness. But at Hampton, it had nothing to do with whiteness. It just had to do with, not in that direct sense, but it had to do with what I affirmed. Mm-hmm. So then I became comfortable in my own skin, and I didn't have to. I had my blackness was with or without reference to whiteness. Does that make sense?
That makes total sense, yeah.
So by the time I got to Westminster, which was 7 years between the time I graduated from college and went to Westminster, I was comfortable in my skin. I knew who I was. I didn't have to. I realized I didn't have to prove myself to anybody. I just went to Westminster. And yes, I saw things that were, there were some insensitivities. I don't think that anybody was intentionally trying to do me in or anything like that, but, and there were insensitivities, but it didn't bother me that much because my life was not defined by that. So I was able to get through Westminster without too much trouble. I mean, I really appreciated my education, and I was disappointed with having to learn all this stuff about how to fight the battles of the Reformation, but that wasn't my battle. My battle was with Louis Farrakhan or whoever. Does that make sense? When I had to do that on my own. But yeah, I was okay because I knew who I was. If I didn't know who I was when I went to Westminster, I would have had some difficulty. Mm-hmm. So, or if I had come to black awareness in a white context, then I would have carried that to Westminster, and my blackness would have been defined by not, by a rejection of whiteness.
So a positive affirmation of what it means to be black is extremely helpful.
That's right.
When it comes to being a minority in a particular space.
It's interesting, my first pastorate, all the black members of the church had come to their consciousness in a white environment. Okay. And so, but me, I hadn't. So they thought I was some kind of, as they called me, a moderate, and not realizing that I was just as militant as they were, but I was shooting with a laser beam, not a shotgun. Okay. So they finally came to understand the context in which you come to consciousness has a lot to do with, if you're in a black environment, you don't have to be black.
Mm-hmm. You just be.
You just are. Right,
yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So that's actually really interesting. So as we're talking about white evangelical spaces, thriving in those spaces as a minority. What advice would you give to a leader of a white evangelical space to allow for minorities to have identity development that is productive and helpful to those people? So to leaders, to give these, and from the lectern, what we try to do is major on being theoretical, but then also out of that theory being constructive,
Right.
to help leaders to actually do the work of
Okay.
of supporting each other. So,
Okay.
yeah, tell me what you'd tell them in
Well,
light of that.
well, first of all, an African American cannot thrive in a white evangelical space if that space is entrenched in white evangelical culture.
Mm-hmm.
If there's no cultural flexibility, then no, you can't. Now, the only way that I could survive in a situation like that is to be totally assimilational to white culture anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, if I was, and by doing that, I can't really say that I'm thriving. I can say that I'm surviving, but I can't say that I'm thriving. And it's just a matter of time before I hit the brick wall.
Mm-hmm.
All my assimilation and everything, somebody's still going to call me the N-word somewhere along the line. All
Yeah.
right? So the only way that the leaders of a white evangelical context have got to, one, understand the fact that the white culture is the dominant culture, black culture is subdominant culture. The dominant culture tends not to recognize the fact that they have a culture.
Mm-hmm.
They have to recognize that they have a culture. They got to recognize that they can't be locked into that culture. The only thing we're locked into is the Bible. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
and there are other ways of doing things. There's more than one way of doing theology, for crying out loud. There's more than one way of worship. I remember in some of my circles, people talk about the regulative principle for worship, that our worship should be governed by Scripture. Okay, I agree with that. But then how they define that it's got to be quiet and this and that and the other, I say, okay, fine. What do you do if you're going to let the Scripture regulate your worship? What do you do when the Scripture tells you to shout or to dance or to do whatever? And they say, oh, well, that's not. So what happens is that the regulative principle is more governed by culture than it is by Scripture.
Mm-hmm.
And so a white evangelical environment should recognize that every environment, I don't care who it is, black, white, whatever, we got to recognize that biblical norms are not necessarily cultural norms.
Mm-hmm.
So if they recognize that, that's the first thing. The second thing is this, that the leaders in such contexts have got to realize that they are the visionaries. They may want diversity and all the rest of that, but they have to understand that there are some people in that institution that are reactionaries. Okay, so you got the visionaries and the reactionaries. The visionaries will bring you in because they have, they want to see something, but the reactionaries will take you out. Okay, I've been through that on several occasions. I'm thinking, and the problem is that the visionaries don't know who the reactionaries are, because the visionaries are not of the group against which the reactionaries are reactionary. Does that make sense?
Can you tease that one out for us?
Yeah, right. The visionaries don't recognize the reactionaries because the reactionaries are reacting against certain kind of people of which the visionaries are not. Does that make sense?
Okay.
So they wouldn't notice that someone so and so is a bigot or whatever, because they're not of the group against which the biggest bigotry is directed.
Mm-hmm.
So they bring you in, and the reactionaries will take you out. And the problem is, generally speaking, the reactionaries have more power in the institution than the visionaries, because the reactionaries base their power on the status quo.
Okay.
The visionaries want to change the status quo, but the status quo has its own. And so what happens is this. Either that happens, the reactionaries will figure out a way to get you out, or the visionary will bring you in, and then the visionary will go somewhere else, and a new pharaoh will come to the throne, who knows not Carl or whatever.
Yeah.
You know, and so those are the dynamics we have to. The visionaries have got to understand that the reactionaries are there. So what they've got to do, they've got to to really work hard, either to root out the reactionaries, or to get them to change them, to change their minds. Because if you don't do that, then it's gonna get real nasty, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can't. So even when a leader wants you there are some people. You know how in Romans 9, Paul says, "Not all who are descended from Israel are Israel."
Mm-hmm.
Well, not everybody who claims to be a Christian is a Christian.
Mm.
Okay, not everybody who claims to believe the Bible believes the Bible, and so you're going to run into this. And so we have to. They have to provide. They have to work hard to make sure that the reactionaries are held at bay. And that, because you see, again, why are the reactionaries, why do they do that? It's because they're wedded to the status quo, and any change in the status quo threatens their power. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the problem is. I mean, look at what happened to Daniel. Here, Darius the Mede comes in, after Babylon is conquered, and he makes Daniel prime minister. Well, there were some petty Persian politicians up in there that didn't want Daniel to have that position because they were into corruption and all the rest of that, and they assumed that Daniel was corrupt and they couldn't find it. Eventually, they got legislation passed,
Mm-hmm.
which said that anybody who prays to God bypassing Darius will be cat food. And so, well, we know how that story turns out, but those are the dynamics. Those are the dynamics that we got to work with, and a lot of our white evangelical brothers and sisters don't realize how entrenched some people are. They're just not everybody. People may be saved, but not everybody's delivered. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. So, as far as the person. Oh, so just I have several questions because you made so many good points. But
okay.
I want to back up to, you said not every institution is a place where you can begin to thrive.
That's right.
So what are the markers of places where you can thrive?
First of all, the institution. If an institution recognizes that they are culture bound in a particular culture, that's a good sign. At least they know that.
Mm-hmm.
They also recognize that they need not to be culture bound. They don't want to be culture bound. That's another good sign. If they have a real sense of bringing God glory in whatever the situation, that's another good sign. So those are things that you need. And you got leadership. You need leadership that not only has the vision but seeks to enhance the safe space. Mm-hmm. By discipling or rooting out the reactionaries.
Yeah,
you got to have those.
That's fantastic. And something I've learned here at Southeastern as we're doing the Kingdom Diversity Initiative and what have you is that there's leadership who are humble enough to learn. Right.
If you don't have leadership that's humble enough to learn, then...
Yeah, and the fact is that you're dealing with high-powered people who are high-powered because they're often assumed to be right.
That's right.
And then now they're having to listen to someone who history and society is saying that we don't have to listen to. Usually that's someone with more pigmentation than you. Right. Someone who has historically less affluent than you. And so the humility to understand that there's something to learn from somebody else is very important if you're going to try to find a space where you can actually thrive. Right.
That's so important. And the other thing too is that people in the dominant group, however you want to define that, the systems that they work in function for them better than they do for the subdominant group. Mm-hmm. And so they may say, "Oh, this is a wonderful system," but you can say that, but it doesn't work that well for me. So if I say something less favorable about the system, a person who doesn't know that, they'd be upset. How dare you say that? But actually, if you see it from my point of view, it doesn't really work. Case in point, I love to go to the Bible. Let's go to the Bible. Right. They had a distribution system in the early church, taking care of widows. Mm-hmm. But the system broke down when it came to the subdominant group, the Greek widows.
Yeah.
And now the apostles could have said, "Well, you should just be glad enough to be in the body. Why do you complain? This is a good system." Instead, they recognized the problem. They knew they did not have the know-how to root out the problem because they were part of the dominant group.
Mm-hmm.
So they appointed 7 Greek deacons. There were no Hebraic Jews in that group. They were Greeks. And they were the ones who were tasked with getting the bugs out of the system and running the distribution system for the Jews and the Greek widows. Mm-hmm. And it looks like they solved it, because you never hear of the Jewish widows complaining about reverse discrimination. You know what I'm saying? So that's the kind of thing. The apostles had wise enough leadership to recognize that, although they were apostles, they were still to some extent culture bound. I mean, you see this with Peter later on. Peter is up in Antioch eating ribs and pork chops and all that, and then here comes James and those guys, and he says, "Oh, let's go to gefilte fish," whatever.
That's funny. That's funny. So that's a great way to identify those places. How, if I'm a leader and I was calling you in to help me identify somebody who was I forget what you call them. Those who love the status quo.
Yeah, the reactionaries.
The reactionaries. There you go.
Right.
If I was a leader and I was, asking you to come in my church or my school and help me identify reactionaries, what characteristics? I know you mentioned broad characteristics, but is there any way that you can help me identify those people, especially because those people aren't reacting to me, but they're reacting to other people in the organization?
Well, first of all, if I was to come into your organization, you need to take me seriously when I point out something. Mm-hmm. Now, on my part, I've got to make sure that I'm not going to try to manipulate you on the basis of that. Does that make sense?
And that's very important.
And that's what, mm-hmm. So you got to choose well the person that you invite to come in, Mm-hmm. You may know some of the reactionaries and stuff, and you may have rooted them out, but you're not going to get them all. There are some who are really more stealthy. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But a lot of times, I would say most of the time, it's a matter of opening their eyes to the fact that, this isn't right, and I never thought of it that way, that kind of thing. So a lot of times it's real simple, but sometimes you got people who are absolutely wedded to the status quo, and they would rather see the organization or the institution be destroyed rather than see it change. There's some people who are just that hardcore.
Yeah.
So that's the thing. But as we're still in that analogy. It would be best for you to do the best you can to root them out before I get there.
Mm-hmm. That's good. That's good to know. Well, so now sort of transitioning from thinking about leaders in white evangelical institutions, let's talk about those who are in institutions who are minorities, or these white evangelical institutions. Okay. What guidance and what encouragement would you give these folks to flourish in white evangelical spaces?
First of all, do not, unless you see a burning bush, do not get caught up in people thinking that you're just there to educate them. Okay. I'll just tell a couple of stories. This has happened to me about 4 times in my life. Here's a person that comes and says, I don't know help me work through some of this. And so I just take the time and I'm going to educate them. I've taken months, maybe years, to help them work it through. Read this, do this, here's something, And after working with them and spending all this time, hundreds and hundreds of hours, they finally come around and see what I'm talking about. They say, okay, I think I get it. Are you saying A, B, C, D, and E? I say, yeah, you got it. They say, oh, okay. Mm-hmm. Well, after 3 years, they say, well, I choose to disagree with you. So, what does that do? I mean, I feel like a young lady who does a one-night stand. I don't know if I've been loved or used. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And so I spent all this time, and they decide that they're not going to believe me. Well, that's one of those things, the dominant culture can get along fine without knowing about the subdominant culture, but not the other way around. Mm-hmm. So that's the first thing. Don't get caught up in that, thinking that your only significance is in educating the dominant culture. Mm-hmm. The other thing, too, is that you have to, if you're going to have any value to the institution in the first place, You've got to be conversant with your own culture. You cannot be totally cut off from your own culture and just be like an Oreo. I mean, you're not going to do anybody any good, including yourself. So those are two things that I could say. Just don't allow yourself to be caught up in this endless cycle of folks ever learning but never coming to a knowledge of truth. At the same time, don't allow yourself to be so assimilational that you're not, because you would give the people in the institution the wrong impression of who, say I would give the people in the white institution the wrong impression of what black people are like. That doesn't do anybody any good. I've got to be, okay, all right. So it's okay to be, it's like I'm identificational. I know, I'm black and proud and all that. But at the same time, though, I seek to be transcendent. And I can understand things from a white point of view, not probably as much as a white person can, but I can understand kind of where they're coming from. And so that gives me a little wisdom on how to operate. Mm-hmm. But if I'm not balanced in that way, then I won't do myself any good. I won't do the institution any good. So,
so you're talking about being identificational, knowing who you are.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people talk about the three-part analogy of that Brian LaRitz has sort of made popular with Carlton, Denzel, and Ice Cube. That C1, C2, C3.
Yeah.
How do you encourage people to be identificational, but even on the spectrum? Because blackness is not monolithic, or even being Hispanic is not monolithic, and what have you.
There are some people who are what I call soft identificationalists, and there are some who are hard identificationalists. And not everybody can be everything, but if we in the group, in the community, we can have all those bases covered, that's fine. Okay. The hard identificationalists need to understand the soft identifications and vice versa. Mm-hmm. So, because there's a place for that. And the other thing, too, is that a lot of times people, like I said, there are people in the oppressed community, or however you want to call it, and sometimes members of their community can be strategically placed in the dominant group. And a lot of times, those of us in the community will say that they're sellouts, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. I mean, Moses was raised in the big house. He wasn't raised in the hood, right? But you can tell that Moses kind of knew who he was, because at the age of 40, he comes back to hang out, with the people of the hood, and it's obvious they had a sense of justice, although he tried to start the revolution a little early, by killing that Egyptian.
Exactly.
But the point is, you kind of knew where he was coming from, and we got to recognize that God sometimes places some of us in strategic places, to be key, to helping things happen. A lot of times people just paint everybody with the same brush. Even African Americans will take a guy like you or me. Both of us are working with predominantly white seminaries, and they will look at us as you said earlier, cooning or something like that. But they don't know what we're doing on the inside. We're working hard to see things happen. Mm-hmm. As I said, Daniel was high up in government in the Nebuchadnezzar administration, and of course Nebuchadnezzar was a tyrant. And but Daniel bided his time. He continued to be faithful to God, and 20 some odd years later, after getting to Babylon, he's able to tell Nebuchadnezzar, "Man, you need to repent in terms of doing justice and all that kind of stuff." I mean, he told him straight. Of course, he didn't listen. Well, he jailhouse conversion, I guess. But 7 years later, he finally comes to his senses, and he tells the whole world. He said, "Yeah, I'm with God now."
Yeah.
And the whole thing changed around. He, was a major improvement. So yeah, I think we have to recognize that God places us in situations sometimes very strategically, and we have to recognize the hand of God in all this. Yeah.
So in the story of Daniel, you actually mentioned 20 years of him, biding his time.
Right.
Today, in the social media world, where the news cycle is hourly and not even daily.
Minute.
Yeah, I mean,
Minute-wise.
it's
Yeah, that's
unbelievable
right.
how
That's right.
fast
That's right.
the news cycle sort of turns over.
Right.
Some people would say if it takes you 20 years to see change, then you've wasted your time.
Okay.
So speak to that reality just a little bit.
All right.
I'm just
Okay. All right.
yeah just
The tortoise and the hare. I mean, the turtle was slow. He made progress, but he got there. He beat the rabbit, right? Okay. A lot of times people get out there and they do this flash in the pan approach, and all they do is, it's like disturbing a bunch of pigeons. You disturb them, and in about a minute they come right back to the same spot. And so there's a lot of people out there, social justice warriors and others, who think that they're accomplishing something because they're making a lot of people mad. They're provoking a lot of people, but all that is just clanging brass and tinkling cymbal. I mean, it's not. Yeah, it's getting a lot of attention, but it's just flash in the pan. But if you're working steadily, trying to develop some things, then that's the way you do it. Now, okay, so look, I'm not going to let social media tell me how to operate. Social media is going to serve me when I operate. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So it might take some time to do some things, but you will accomplish something. But getting out there and yelling and shouting and making people mad is not going to accomplish anything.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you show me. I mean, termites are not known for being architects.
So true.
Right? They just consume stuff, And so it's the same thing. It's like, there's, like I said, there's a lot of people out there that are going out saying a whole lot of things, and they're not accomplishing anything.
Yeah, it's because it seems like a lot of people are content to critique.
Right.
A lot of people are content to talk about the angst and the difficulty of being in certain spaces, but never or very rarely, in my own observation, which are only my observations, I could be missing some things, are people trying to be constructive.
Right. Now there comes a time, when okay, case in point again. Let's go back to the Bible, all right? All right. Okay. Okay. Question: were the scribes and Pharisees the bad guys or the good guys? In
Bad guys.
They're the bad guys. That's right. We agree on that. So why did Jesus take 23 chapters before he denounced them? You see, 23 chapters in Matthew. I mean, all that time he encountered them and all that, but he never. I mean, he blasted them out of the water in chapter 23. Why didn't he do that? I'll tell you why. Because they're the bad guys, right? But he knew that some of those bad guys would respond to the voice of the shepherd. And so as he encountered them and he dealt with them, and then when all the people who would follow him, and a lot of scribes and Pharisees followed Jesus, when all of them came out of that group, the only thing left were the dregs, the people who were idolatrous, who for whom the Jewish religion was, their idol. Then Jesus blasted them out of the water.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of people today, they look at a group and they say, oh, all of them are bad guys, not realizing that we got to speak with the voice of the shepherd, because some people are going to hear the voice and respond. And God, isn't it Jesus himself who said, let God sort out the wheat from the tare? So I think that say a lot of my friends who go out there and they shout at everybody, they don't understand. They might be pulling up good wheat with the weeds, with the tares.
That's good.
Yeah.
So don't grow weary in well doing. I hear you say.
Yeah. It's it gets tiring sometimes.
Oh yeah, that's for sure.
But like I said, I've lived long enough that I've seen some significant progress on some things, and I've learned some lessons. Like I said, I'm not going to get caught up in somebody telling me to convince them to do the right thing. I'm not going to spend a lot of time trying to convince them to do the right thing if they're not convinced. If they come to me having already been convinced and they just want my help and guidance in doing the right thing, I'd help in a minute. But I'm not going to try to prove that, if you're not at that point, then you just go read some books or something like that. But I'm not going to get caught up in trying to convince somebody who doesn't want to be convinced. Yeah.
That's good. That's good. So just as we close, it seems as though we've identified that minorities can thrive in some white evangelical spaces, being very discerning on which ones you enter into.
Right.
So the question, I guess, can become this: is it even worth having to take these steps to try to thrive in these spaces, or should we just make new spaces, new colleges, new seminaries, and what have you?
Sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. I think of if I'm working, say I'm working with the seminary, and if the seminary is committed to what we're trying to do, then if we need another seminary of some kind, that they would be open to that, and it will be in partnership with the existing seminary. I mean, why do we have to reinvent the wheel in some ways? We can start something that would, and I think that, and in some cases, we might need our own thing. And if we do our own thing, we have to be open to, say, we do our own seminary, we have to stay in dialogue with the existing seminaries that are interested, because sometimes people can't see a concept unless they see a model of it. And once they see a model of it, they say, "Oh, that's what you're talking about." I just taught in my seminary. I just taught a course for the second time on a different approach to apologetics, urban apologetics, and they saw it twice. They saw the response of the students, and now they came back at me and said, "Okay, we want to make this not just an elective, but we want to make this an alternative in terms of the core curriculum."
That's fantastic.
Now, that's some amazing stuff. So now, and there's a lot of things that, my wife and I have started this institute to try to kind of specialize training, but, my seminary now is interested in that, and they would like to have some interface with that, and that's good. That's good. That can't hurt, So, so it depends. Sometimes you might have to start something and then let them see, they get it, and wants to see the model. And sometimes the institution is forward thinking enough that they can see the concept and they would be committed to it.
Well, that's good. So, yes, start some spaces, but it matters the posture of that space.
Right.
I guess is what you're saying. So,
right. It's interesting. I think a lot of my African American activist type friends, they see, they say, "Oh man, these white evangelicals, they're this, they're that, and the other. So I'm just going to do something for black people." Well, okay. So why are they fed up with the white folks? It's because they're sinners. That's why. So they're going to do this thing for black folk. I'm going to live by myself. But you know what they're going to find out? That black folks are sinners too. It might be a different set of things, but it's going to be some problems. So there's no, black is beautiful. I love my people and all that. But hey, my people are sinners, and they're gonna, there's gonna be some problem somewhere. So it's all a mess, So we just have to recognize that, So, I think we those of us in the subdominant group, in the oppressed group, whatever you want to call, sometimes we get lulled into thinking that we are in some ways immune to sin. We are immune to sin because we see the dominant group. They're the ones that are sinners. We're just the victims. But give us our own chance to do things, and we'll do. We may not do exactly the same thing, but we'll do something as bad. So we have to recognize that there's no paradise. There's no place where sin does not come in.
Yeah. There's no paradise outside the kingdom.
Exactly.
Well, that's good.
Exactly.
Well, thank you for your time.
You got it.
Thank you for gracing us with your presence on our campus.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you guys for watching from the lectern. This is Walter Strickland. Dr. Carl Ellis Jr. is our guest today. For more information about Southeastern Seminary, you can go to scbts.edu. For more information about Kingdom Diversity Initiative, you can go to kingdomdiversity.scbts.edu. or follow us on Twitter at K_diversity. Grace and peace.